Would anybody like to take my place this morning and answer this question? It's a most difficult question to answer. And I look back into my records and I realized that I had not preached a sermon like this in probably 40 years. One reason it's so difficult to answer is because we're all different. We have different tastes, different appetites, likes and dislikes. And as a consequence, keeping the Sabbath may be very different between you. Anyway, this morning we're going to probe it. And I don't intend to offend anybody. And so I apologize up front if I say something that offends you. Please forgive me. It's not my intention. Let's start with looking at what Jesus said in Mark 2 and verse 27. Jesus said, upon this one occasion, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Think about that for a moment. What does that mean? Which is the most important? According to Jesus right here, which is the most important? Man. Man is more important than the Sabbath. Man was not created to obey the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us, to benefit us. In some way, the Sabbath is for our benefit. That gives the Sabbath a total different concept, a different picture. Jesus wants us to all recognize the Sabbath was not given to correct us, harass us, restrict us. The Sabbath was given to bless us, to help us in some way. Now, in this particular case, we back up a few verses to verses 23 and 24, we'll find the occasion that prompted Jesus to say the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now, the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew says that the disciples were hungry. And because they were hungry, they ate some of the grain. There's a whole lot of questions I'd like to ask Jesus about this. We wish we knew more about it. For instance, when did this happen on the Sabbath? Were Jesus and the disciples on the way to church and walked through the grain field to get to church? Or was church over and they were walking through the grain fields going somewhere? Why were they walking through grain fields? There are roads, there are footpaths. Why were they in a grain field? And why were the disciples hungry? Didn't they have breakfast? Didn't they make preparations for the Sabbath? And are we supposed to make preparations? Why didn't they? They didn't, apparently. The disciples were hungry. They hadn't had anything to eat. Maybe they were expecting somebody to invite them out for dinner, and nobody did. I don't know. That's happened to me a few times. In fact, my wife and I, when we traveled a lot, going to different churches, we'd take a lunch with us just in case we didn't get invited out. If we knew the answer to all these questions, it might give us a little more insight into what Jesus was saying. But it does tell us something about Sabbath keeping, doesn't it? For some reason, we don't know why, Jesus and the disciples are walking through the grain fields. The disciples are hungry, and they begin to eat some of the grain. Now, listen, folk, you've got to be hungry to eat wheat out of the grain field. You've got to really be hungry. Now, it could have been barley. I've never eaten barley nuts, but I buy grain, 50-pound bags of just wheat. I ground up to make my bread with. And I tell you what, I'm not hungry enough to eat wheat. I enjoy Bulgar wheat for breakfast sometimes, and I have to soak it overnight to make it palatable. And these disciples are eating that grain right out of the field. I don't know how they did it. They got better teeth than I've got. But it does, in my mind, cause me to wonder, if Sabbath is so important you should prepare your meals on Friday, then why didn't Jesus and the disciples do it? I don't know. Anyway, keep in mind, we're trying to probe the Sabbath. What's right? What's wrong? What's right for you? What will make it a happy day? Sabbath's not going to be a happy day if you're hungry. Well, the New Testament doesn't say very much about Sabbath keeping. Really doesn't. In fact, it doesn't tell us how to keep the Sabbath. Not really. I challenge you to find something in the New Testament where it says how we're supposed to keep the Sabbath. Now, I know the Old Testament does. Hey, folk, life is different today than it was in the Old Testament times when they lived in tents. Okay, here's another Sabbath keeping experience that we find in the New Testament. Matthew 12, verses 11 and 12. Then he said to them, Jesus, what man is there among you who has one sheep? And if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold on it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Let me ask you a question. Just think about it. Is it lawful to do good in order to keep your job? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath to make money? Is that what Jesus is saying? It's lawful to do good, and it's all right if you make money in the process. And it's all right if that's what you're going to do to keep your job. Is that what Jesus is saying? Or is Jesus saying, we want to be a blessing to our fellow man as much as we can, and we'll do what we can to bless them on Sabbath the same as we can any other week? The other week. You know, a question, think about it. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, but is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath in order to keep a job? That's the question. Another text that comes close to giving us a hint at how we should keep the Sabbath, probably the only text it does, Luke 4, verse 16. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. This indicates that Jesus had the custom of going to church on Sabbath. I don't know what time of the day it was. Was it Sabbath morning, Sabbath afternoon? I don't know, but it was Sabbath. I could have even been Friday night. I don't know. But anyway, it says, he went into the synagogue as his custom was. Now, Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25 doesn't actually mention the Sabbath. But it apparently is referring to the Sabbath, because this is what it says. Paul says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Let's probe that just a little bit. I'm assuming that Paul is talking about going to church. But notice what he says we're to do. Exhorting one another. We go to church to exhort each other, to encourage each other. We're living in a day different from the Apostle Paul's. We're living in a day when you can just flip your computer on and watch a sermon from anywhere in the whole United States, all around the world, I guess. There's 10,000 sermons you could be staying home watching this morning instead of being here. But you can't encourage anybody by staying home. You can't exhort anybody to stay home if you're staying home. The only way you can fulfill your individual mission as a Christian to encourage your brothers and sisters in the faith is if you are in church with them. I know it's very easy to get up on Sabbath morning and leisurely eat your breakfast and don't worry about getting dressed. You can stay in your pajamas and turn on the computer or turn on the TV and pull up a sermon from wherever you want to watch a sermon and enjoy a good sermon, and you probably can stay home and watch a whole lot better sermon than you're going to hear here. But one thing you can't do is staying at home, watch your sermon. You can't encourage anybody. You're not talking to people about their faith, the struggles they have, the challenges they face. I tell you, folks, sometimes we need to be able to share, express the frustrations, the challenges, problems that we're facing. It really sometimes helps to have somebody just put the arm around your shoulder and say, I'm praying for you. I had an older couple, I don't even know where it was now, years and years ago, when I was a young pastor. They said, we want you to know, Pastor, we've adopted you, and we're going to pray for you day and night as long as we live. You're the pastor we're praying for. We've taken that challenge. That made me feel good. That was encouraging to know that no matter what happens to me, that old couple somewhere was praying for me. Well, okay, let's go on. Luke 14, verses 1 to 4. This is sort of interesting. Now it happened, as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, and that they watched him closely. Wow. Think about that. A Pharisee invited Jesus to have dinner with him. Did the Pharisees like Jesus? Huh? No, they didn't. Pharisees hated Jesus. Why would somebody that hates me invite me home for dinner? You answer that. And if I'm invited home to somebody's house who I know doesn't like me, why would I go? Why would I make some kind of excuse? Well, in this particular case, the Pharisees had a reason for inviting Jesus. Look at it. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And go back to the previous sentence. They watched him carefully. This is a setup. The Pharisees planned this whole scenario. They had a man invited to that same dinner who had a physical problem, a disease, a sickness. And it says the Pharisees invited Jesus. They watched him closely to see what he would do. And he did just exactly what they hoped he'd do. And Jesus, answering, spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But they kept silent, and took him and healed him and let him go. I don't know what all could be considered lawful to do on the Sabbath. I don't know where to draw the line. There's some tension between what we've just read and what I'm going to read in just a moment. There's tension. And it's not always easy for me as an individual or you as an individual to know where to draw that, what do they call it, red line? I read the other day, yesterday I guess, that China says we've crossed the red line. I don't know what that means, but anyway. There's only one other text that has anything to do with Sabbath keeping. John chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. This has a lot of implications too. A lot of questions we could ask about this experience. Well, let's read it. This man was sick, very sick. And Jesus said to him, rise, take up your bed, and walk. Immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. Guess what? In Jesus' day, you didn't carry your bed on Sabbath. That was a no-no. That was working on the Sabbath. Jesus knew that. Why did Jesus ask this man, or tell this man, pick up your bed and carry it around with you and walk? Display to everybody that you're breaking the Sabbath. You're working by carrying your bed. Deliberately telling this man on the Sabbath to create a fuss, create havoc out there, show defiance, carry your bed on the Sabbath. Why? Well, certainly got attention to see a man walking around on the Sabbath carrying his bed. What was Jesus trying to tell us? What do we learn from this? Obviously, it was not wrong. It was not sinful for that man to carry his bed and walk around Jerusalem carrying his bed. Did it weigh very much? I don't know. It might have been a little lightweight thing. I don't know. I'm sure he was walking around carrying in a spring mattress. Well, he's a whole lot bigger man than I am. What lesson can we learn from this? Remember, Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Probably today, if we saw somebody walking around on the Sabbath carrying a big heavy burden, we'd say he shouldn't be doing that. Wouldn't we? By and large, that's the attitude today. We don't carry burdens around on the Sabbath. You don't needlessly carry around a bed. He didn't have to be carrying that bed. Jesus could have said, just get up and walk. So it puzzles me. I don't really know what to make out of it. Except this. It seems that Jesus is saying, hey, remember this. Circumstances are different. People are different. Remember, the Sabbath was not made to harass you and restrict you. It was made to bless you. And sometimes we may be called upon to do something on the Sabbath that normally we wouldn't do. Okay? Normally that man wouldn't be carrying a bed around on Sabbath. I'm not sure. I really don't. I'm really not sure what Jesus is telling me here. Except, I come back to the Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for us to enjoy, made for us to to bless us, not to restrict us and harangue us and make life difficult. I don't know. Well, I guess all I can do is leave it. But Jesus did it deliberately and obviously had a message not only for the Jews of his day, but for Seventh-day Adventists of our day. I'll leave it up to you to draw what lesson you can from it. But listen, there's a lesson in it for you. Now, I said there was a tension between some of these scriptures. Now, here's where the tension begins. Back to the fourth commandment. Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. The fourth commandment. Listen to it. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I'm not sure what that means. What does it mean to keep a day holy? 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. What does that mean to you? Was carrying a bed around on Sabbath work? Was it necessary work? No. Not necessary. But was work. Tension. I don't know the answer. But the fourth commandment is very similar to the story of the creation of the Sabbath back in Genesis 2 and verse 3. Let's look at that one. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Because in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. How do you bless a day? How do you sanctify a day? And especially, let's go back to Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for man. So does that mean that God blessed the seventh day for me? Does that mean that God sanctified the seventh day for me? Well, how in the world do I get blessing and sanctification out of a day? This may be just as nonsensical as it can be. But let's just suppose up in heaven, I think heaven is a planet like Earth is a planet where God dwells. Up there somewhere, God has a giant transmitter. And once a week, for 24 hours, he turns that transmitter on. 50,000 watts, 200,000, I don't know, big one. For once a week for 24 hours, he turns that transmitter on and beams toward this earth God's blessing and God's sanctification. Much like a Super Bowl, football, Super Bowl Sunday, a special occasion. If you want to receive that blessing, if you want to receive that sanctification, you've got to tune in to the right channel. Okay? Tune in to God. Turn your thoughts, your mind, your attention toward God. It's just a matter of turning aside everything that would distract you, and for this 24 hours to receive that special blessing and sanctification signal, concentrate, tuning your mind in on God, thinking about God, meditating. Keep tuned in. Stay tuned in so that you can receive that blessing and sanctification. I don't know whether it works that way or not, but somehow God put blessing and sanctification in the Sabbath day for me and for you. And if we're going to receive that blessing and that sanctification, then we have to tune in. We can't ignore it. If we ignore it, we lose it. We miss it. Just like if you don't turn the television set on when the Super Bowl's on, you miss it. Or you can get some previews, but you don't see the whole game. You miss the blessing. And it appears to me that the fourth commandment is simply saying, please, for your own benefit, tune in. Listen. You might be surprised what you hear. Don't let everything else distract you. Don't let your work distract you. Don't let your bills distract you. Don't let anything else distract you. Clear things out of your life and spend this 24-hour period letting me bless you. That appears to me what we can read out of the fourth commandment. And that might mean different things to different ones of us. I don't think any of us can be a judge of anybody else. Because through the years, I've learned that what blesses me doesn't necessarily bless you. Okay, here's the daddy of all text on the Sabbath keeping. You've been wondering when I was going to get to it, weren't you? Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. This is the foundation stone. This is the foundation of the whole building of the Sabbath. Listen to it from God's counsel to the Israelites through Isaiah. Again, much like what I just said about tuning in. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high places of the earth. I would like to change a word. I don't think I'm doing injustice to the text. But listen to this change. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and instead of the word call, I would like to suggest the word make, M-A-K-E. And make the Sabbath a delight. Hey, it's our choice, isn't it? Whether the Sabbath is going to be a light, it's our choice. It's our attitude. Instead of the word call it a delight, which, okay, it means about the same thing, doesn't it? But make the Sabbath. We have to individually, as Christians, choose to make the Sabbath a delight. We can choose to make it a burden, can't we? God wants us to delight in the Sabbath. He wants us to enjoy the Sabbath. I did something this week that I've never done before. But I called my 4 children up and talked to them about their childhood and the Sabbath. I learned some things. I talked to 4 of my grandchildren. And I asked them, what was your attitude toward the Sabbath growing up? I learned some more things. Not good. In fact, it's really discouraged me. When I was talking to my oldest son, Kent, he and his son were flying to the Philippines, I think, to hold evangelistic meetings. Both of them were going to hold evangelistic meetings. And on this long flight, I don't know from where to where, probably from the United States to Guam. I think they went through Guam. Anyway, on a long flight, my son and his son, my grandson, were studying the sermon they were going to preach on a certain topic, and they decided to go over that sermon, so they had their Bibles out. They took the tray down on the seat in front of them, and they had their Bibles laying on that tray, and they were discussing the Bible and reading it, and a lady across the aisle, she leaned over and said, "Is that a Bible?" "Yeah, that's a Bible." She said, "I didn't know anybody read that anymore." "Yeah, we do." And she says, "I used to. I was made to." Didn't enjoy it, but I was made to do it. She said, my parents were missionaries for somebody. She didn't say who. And they were very, very, very strict. As a child, I had no choice. I went to church. Every week I was in church. Whether I liked it or not, I was there. And then after church, to make things even worse, my parents made me sit down while they read to me out of a boring book. And this time my son knew who he was talking to. He said, you were raised a Seventh-day Adventist, weren't you? Yeah, how'd you know? And he said that book it was being read to, that was a Spirit of Prophecy book. Elder White book, was it? Yes, it was. And she said, as soon as I had the opportunity, I left it all. Were the parents Sabbath keeping? Possibly. For them, it was a delight. But for their daughter, what was it? Torture. It killed her faith. And as soon as she was able to, she walked away from the whole mess. You're aware, aren't you, that in the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, we lose at least half of our young people? They walk away from it as soon as they're able to. Well, like I said, I talked to my children. I talked to my grandchildren. 4 of them at least. I got 11, but I talked to 4 of them. One told me, I asked her attitude about the Sabbath growing up, and here's her attitude. She said, I find it boring. And the only reason I go to church is because of my friends. Take away my friends, and I'd stop going to church tomorrow. That broke my heart. That was sad. Sad, sad. And you know what? My children, 4 children, 4 grandchildren, all said somewhat the same thing about the importance of friends. Friends is what made church endurable. And I used that word deliberately. Let's be honest. Children don't enjoy church service. I bet there's not a young person here this morning that says they really enjoy being here. Especially the younger ones. Church service is boring to children. I'll buy that. In fact, my children and my grandchildren all created the impression, as I talked to them about different things, I got the impression that they enjoyed Sabbath school in cradle roll, kindergarten, primary, but not juniors and early teens. Most of them said that by the time they got to be 10 or 11 years old, they stopped enjoying Sabbath school. Now, I don't know why. Did they have poor Sabbath school teachers? I was talking to one of you this morning for church, especially boys. This applies to especially boys, but it applies to girls too. Who are most of the teachers in cradle roll, kindergarten, and primary? Men or women? Women. somewhere along the line, these boys and girls need to hear a man's voice. And if they get to juniors and it's still women, get to primaries and it's still women, before long they're going to get the impression that church is for women. We lose them. When they get to high school or college age, we lose them. Because while to missionary parents, spending the Sabbath studying, reading, may be a delight, but it's certainly not a delight to children. And so, parents, you've got to make the Sabbath a delight to your children. And folks, I thought I was. In fact, 3 of my 4 children all mentioned, and they said, fellowship with Dad on Sabbath afternoons was something they remembered about the Sabbath. Sabbath afternoon was time Dad was home, and Dad did things with us. We went for walks, we played games, but Sabbath afternoon was Dad time. So thank the Lord, at least that. So if you are living alone, single, or if you're parents, or if you're older couple, husbands and wives, remember, God wants you to enjoy the Sabbath. He wants you to make the Sabbath a delight. And what makes the Sabbath a delight to you may not appeal to somebody else. But if whatever you're doing, if it's turning your mind and thoughts toward God, then fine. But if you have children, let me remind you that what's a delight to you is not a delight to them. And let me tell you, especially when they get to be 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, who has a tough time to make Sabbath a delight? You've got to work at it. And I'll confess to you, I did a lot of things when my children were small. And I did a lot more things when my children were teenagers that I wouldn't do as an adult. We, at times, carried our bed on the Sabbath. Understand what I'm saying? In order to keep my children, especially my boys, happy. Making my boys enjoy the Sabbath. I don't know that I've ever asked God to forgive me for the things I did with the boys and girls on Sabbath. It could probably fall in the category of carrying your bed. I think it was justified. My 4 children are all faithful in the church today. My grandchildren are all safe in the church, maybe with one exception. Now that I'm as old as I am, what makes me enjoy the Sabbath may be totally different than what you would enjoy doing for the Sabbath. I just want to leave you with the text I started with. Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for you to enjoy, to take delight in, for you to receive a blessing from,